The sun was a merciless fist, pounding the earth until it split like old leather. Dust rose in lazy swirls, coating Amos Reed's boots as he stood on the porch of his sagging ranch house. His shadow stretched long and thin across the cracked ground, like a man half erased. The air smelled of scorched grass and distant rain that would never come. His hands, calloused and knotted, gripped the railing until the wood groaned. 3 days without sleep had carved hollows beneath his eyes, and the ache in his chest wasn't just from hunger. The ranch was dying, cattle gone, fields barren, and the last hired hand had ridden off a week ago, taking the good horse with him. Amos was alone, save for the cook he'd hired out of pity, a woman whose name he barely remembered but whose quiet presence kept the house from feeling like a tomb. Inside, a pan clattered to the floor, sharp and sudden. Amos turned, squinting through the open door. The cook, Mary, that was her name, stood frozen in the kitchen, her back to him, shoulders hunched like she was bracing for a blow. A bruise bloomed on her wrist, purple and angry, peeking from the sleeve of her faded dress. It hadn't been there yesterday. Amos's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. He'd seen marks like that before, on his mother, years ago, when his father's temper turned the house into a battlefield. He stepped inside, boots heavy on the warped floorboards. The air was thick with the smell of burned bread and something sharper, like fear. Mary didn't turn. She knelt, picking up the pan with trembling hands, her braid falling over one shoulder. The bruise seemed to pulse in the dim light, a silent accusation. Amos stood in the doorway, his shadow falling across her like a storm cloud. He wanted to ask who'd done it, but the words stuck in his throat, dry as the land outside. Instead, he cleared his throat, rough and low. "You all right?" His voice sounded foreign, unused. She flinched, just a flicker, but enough to make his gut twist. "Fine," she said, barely above a whisper, not meeting his eyes. She stood, smoothing her apron, and turned back to the stove. The bruise vanished under her sleeve, but Amos couldn't unsee it. He thought of the town, a half-day's ride away, where men drank too much and settled scores with their fists. He thought of the drifter who'd lingered near the gate last week, watching the house with hungry eyes. He thought of his own hands, empty and useless. The day passed in silence, heavy and oppressive. Amos worked the fence line, hammering posts into ground that fought back, his mind circling the bruise like a vulture. By dusk, the sky burned red, and the air grew sharp with the promise of a cold night. He returned to the house, sweat-soaked and aching, to find Mary setting a plate of beans and cornbread on the table. Her sleeve was pulled down tight, but he caught the edge of another mark, this one on her forearm, faint but unmistakable. His appetite vanished. He sat anyway, the chair creaking under his weight. The food was warm, but it tasted like ash. Mary moved quietly, her steps deliberate, like she was trying not to wake something sleeping. Amos watched her, the way her hands shook when she poured water, the way her eyes darted to the door. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of his own failures pressed down on him. The ranch was crumbling, his life was crumbling, and now this woman, who'd come to him broken and needing work, was carrying wounds he couldn't fix. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a warning. Amos pushed his plate away, untouched. He stood, his shadow swallowing the small kitchen. Mary froze, her hand on the dishcloth, her breath catching. He saw it then, the fear in her eyes, not of him, but of something else, something that followed her like a ghost. He wanted to reach out, to tell her she was safe, but the words felt like lies. Instead, he turned and walked out, the screen door slamming behind him. The stars were sharp overhead, indifferent to the smallness of his world. The night air bit at Amos's knuckles as he stood on the porch, the cold seeping through his worn coat. The stars above were merciless pinpricks, too distant to offer comfort. The ranch stretched out before him, a vast, empty sprawl of failure. Fences leaning, barns sagging, the ghosts of cattle long sold off. His breath fogged in the chill, each exhale a reminder of the life draining out of this place. But it wasn't the ranch that kept him awake. It was the bruise on Mary's wrist, the way it seemed to speak of a violence he couldn't name but felt in his bones. He'd seen his mother hide her own marks, her eyes dull with shame, and the memory clawed at him now, sharp as barbed wire. He turned back to the house, its single-lit window glowing like a weary eye. Inside, Mary was washing dishes, her movements slow, deliberate, as if each motion cost her something. Amos lingered in the doorway, unseen, watching the way her shoulders tensed when a floorboard creaked. He thought of his childhood, of nights spent listening to his father's boots stomp through the house, each step a warning. His mother would hum softly, a hymn to drown out the fear, but it never worked. Amos had been too young to help her, too small to stand between her and the fist. Now, standing in his own house, he felt that same helplessness, a boy trapped in a man's body. He stepped inside, the warmth of the kitchen a faint reprieve. Mary didn't look up, her hand submerged in the soapy water, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. The bruise on her wrist caught the lamplight, a dark bloom against her pale skin. Amos's throat tightened. He wanted to ask, "Who did this? Where did you come from? Why are you here?" but the questions felt like accusations. Instead, he grabbed his hat from the hook, the brim worn soft from years of use, and muttered, "Goin' to check the barn." The night was colder now, the wind carrying a low moan across the plains. The barn smelled of old hay and rot, the kind of decay that settled into everything out here. Amos lit a lantern, its weak glow barely pushing back the dark. He didn't need to check anything, there was nothing left to steal, nothing left to break, but he needed the distance, the space to think. He sat on a bale of straw, the lantern at his feet, and let his mind drift. He remembered the day Mary arrived, 2 months back, stepping off the stagecoach in town with a single bag and eyes that didn't meet anyone's gaze. She'd answered his ad for a cook, her voice quiet but steady, asking for work like it was the last thing tethering her to the world. Amos had taken her on because he couldn't afford not to, his own cooking was barely fit for dogs, and the ranch was too far from town for anyone else to bother. But now, seeing those bruises, he wondered what he'd let into his house. Not danger, but a mirror, reflecting back his own failures, his own ghosts. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that danced like memories. He thought of his mother's hands, always busy, always hiding the marks. He thought of the day she left, not a word, just a note on the table, "Gone to my sister's." She never came back. His father drank himself to death a year later, and Amos inherited the ranch, a cursed patch of earth that seemed to demand more than it ever gave. He'd tried to make it work, poured his youth into it, but the land didn't care. Neither did the town, with its whispers and sideways glances, calling him a fool for clinging to a dream that was already dust. A sound broke his thoughts, a soft crunch outside, not the wind. Amos stood, heart thudding, and grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall. He stepped into the night, the lantern left behind, its light too weak for what he might find. The plains stretched out, black and endless, the stars offering no guidance. Something moved near the fence line, a shadow that didn't belong. Amos tightened his grip on the rifle, his breath shallow, and moved toward it, the cold biting deeper now, not just into his skin but into the marrow of who he was. The shadow moved again, low and quick, disappearing behind the skeletal frame of the corral. Amos's boots crunched on the frost-kissed ground, each step deliberate, his rifle a cold weight against his shoulder. The night was a living thing, pressing against him, the wind hissing secrets he couldn't decipher. His pulse hammered, not from fear but from something older, a rage that had simmered since he was a boy watching his mother flinch at shadows. The bruise on Mary's wrist burned in his mind, a beacon pulling him forward. Whoever was out there, lurking on his land, had answers he needed. He crouched near the fence, eyes straining against the dark. The stars gave just enough light to trace the outline of a figure, slight, hunched, moving toward the house. Not a drifter, not a thief. Something about the way it moved felt furtive, like a fox slipping through a henhouse. Amos's breath caught, sharp and cold, as he crept closer, keeping the corral between him and the figure. The rifle felt heavy now, less a tool and more a burden. He didn't want to use it, but the weight of it steadied him, a reminder that he could act, could protect something for once. The figure paused near the back of the house, where the kitchen window glowed faintly. Amos saw it clearly now, a man, wary, his coat tattered at the hem. He carried no lantern, no weapon that Amos could see, but his posture was predatory, head tilted as if listening for something inside. Mary. Amos's grip tightened, his knuckles white against the rifle's stock. He thought of her in the kitchen, scrubbing that same plate, her eyes darting to the door. He moved closer, silent as the night allowed, until he was near enough to hear the man's ragged breathing. "Step away," Amos said, voice low but steady, cutting through the wind. The man froze, then turned slowly, hands raised. His face was half-shadowed, but Amos saw the sharp angles of hunger, the kind of desperation that made men dangerous. "Ain't here to cause trouble," the man said, his voice rough, like gravel underfoot. "Just lookin' for someone." Amos kept the rifle leveled, not at the man's chest but close enough to make the point. "Who?" he asked, though he already knew. The man's eyes flicked to the house, to the window where Mary's silhouette moved, oblivious. "My wife," he said, and the word landed like a stone in Amos's gut. "She run off. Heard she's here, cookin' for you." Amos's mind reeled, the bruise on Mary's wrist flashing like a warning. He saw his mother again, her hands trembling as she poured coffee, pretending the marks on her arms were from a fall. He saw himself, too small to stop it, too weak to change anything. "She ain't yours," Amos said, the words coming unbidden, hard as iron. The man's eyes narrowed, a spark of anger flaring. "You got no say in that," he spat, taking a step forward. Amos raised the rifle an inch, and the man stopped, hands still raised but fingers twitching. The wind howled, carrying dust that stung Amos's eyes. He wanted to ask about the bruises, to demand the truth, but the man's gaze was a challenge, daring him to act. Amos felt the weight of the ranch behind him, the years of loss, the emptiness that had settled into his bones. But he also felt Mary's fear, her quiet resilience, the way she kept the house alive despite her own wounds. He lowered the rifle slightly, just enough to ease the tension. "Leave," he said. "Don't come back." The man hesitated, his jaw working like he was chewing on a reply. Then he turned, slow, and slipped into the dark, his footsteps fading into the night. Amos stood there, the rifle heavy in his hands, until the cold drove him back to the house. Inside, Mary was still at the sink, her back to him, her hands moving slower now, like she was carrying the weight of the world. He wanted to tell her what had happened, to ask her story, but the words stayed locked inside. Instead, he hung the rifle on the wall and sat at the table, the silence between them louder than the wind outside. The kitchen was a cocoon of lamplight, the air thick with the scent of lye soap and cooling cornbread. Amos sat at the table, his hands folded, rough and useless, while Mary scrubbed the last dish with a rhythm that felt like prayer. The silence between them was a living thing, heavy with unspoken questions. The encounter outside lingered in Amos's chest, a stone lodged where his heart should be. He could still see the man's eyes, sharp with possession, and the bruise on Mary's wrist seemed to pulse in the corner of his vision, a silent demand for action he didn't know how to take. She dried her hands on her apron, movements careful, deliberate, as if each gesture was a shield. Her braid had loosened, strands falling across her cheek, catching the light like threads of gold in the dimness. Amos noticed the way she kept her left arm close, hiding the marks, and it stirred something in him, anger, yes, but also a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. He thought of his mother's hands, always moving, always hiding, and the way he'd failed her. He wouldn't fail again, not if he could help it. "Mary," he said, his voice rough, like it had been scraped raw by the wind. She stiffened, her hand pausing on the dishcloth, but she didn't turn. "Who's he to you?" The question hung in the air, heavy as the dust outside. She didn't answer right away, and the silence stretched, taut as a bowstring. Finally, she turned, her eyes meeting his for the first time that night. They were gray, like storm clouds, and carried a weight that made Amos's breath catch. "He's my husband," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, each word a stone dropped into still water. "Was." She looked down, her fingers twisting the cloth. "I left him 3 towns back. Thought I'd gotten far enough." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her lips together, as if to trap the rest inside. Amos leaned forward, elbows on the table, the wood creaking under his weight. He wanted to ask about the bruises, to know the shape of her pain, but the words felt too big, too sharp. Instead, he said, "He was here. Outside. Lookin' for you." Her eyes widened, a flash of fear, and she took a step back, the dishcloth falling to the floor. Amos raised a hand, palm out, slow. "He's gone. I sent him off." Her breath hitched, and she nodded, quick and small, like a bird startled but not yet ready to fly. "He won't come back," Amos added, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The man's eyes had carried a hunger that didn't fade easy. Mary sank into a chair across from him, her hands trembling in her lap. The lamplight carved shadows across her face, making her look older, then younger, then ageless. "I didn't mean to bring trouble," she said, her voice low, threaded with shame. "I just needed somewhere to be." Amos nodded, his throat tight. He knew that need, the ache for a place to stand when the world kept shifting beneath you. The ranch was his, crumbling as it was, and he'd let her stay because he saw that same need in her eyes the day she arrived. He stood, the chair scraping against the floor, and moved to the window. The night outside was black as pitch, the stars hidden now behind clouds that promised nothing good. He thought of the man out there, somewhere, waiting. He thought of the ranch, its emptiness a mirror of his own. And he thought of Mary, carrying wounds he couldn't see but felt all the same. "You're safe here," he said, turning back to her. The words felt fragile, but he meant them, and her eyes softened, just a fraction, like a crack in a frozen river. She didn't speak, just nodded again, her hands still in her lap, fingers knotted together. Amos wanted to say more, to promise her something solid, but the weight of his own failures held him back. Instead, he picked up the dishcloth from the floor and set it on the table, a small gesture that felt like all he had to give. The wind rattled the window, a low moan that seemed to carry both their pasts, and Amos wondered if safety was something he could ever truly offer. The morning broke cold, the sky a bruised gray that pressed low over the ranch. Frost dusted the ground, fragile as lace, crunching under Amos's boots as he hauled water from the well. His breath hung in the air, each pull of the rope a tug against the ache in his shoulders. The house stood silent behind him, its weathered boards blending into the bleak horizon. Inside, Mary was already moving, the faint clatter of pots a rhythm against the stillness. Amos paused, bucket heavy in his hand, and glanced at the kitchen window. Her shadow passed across it, steady but guarded, like a deer stepping through a clearing. He carried the water inside, the door creaking as he entered. Mary was at the stove, stirring oatmeal, her sleeve pulled down tight over her wrist. The bruise was hidden, but Amos felt its presence, a ghost in the room. He set the bucket down, water sloshing, and cleared his throat. "Town today," he said, not looking at her. "Need supplies. You comin'?" It wasn't just an offer, it was a test, a way to see if she'd risk the open road, where her husband might be waiting. Her spoon stopped, hovering over the pot. For a moment, she was still, her eyes fixed on the steam rising like a prayer. "I'll stay," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "Got enough to do here." Amos nodded, though disappointment flickered in his chest. He'd hoped she'd come, hoped the ride might loosen the knot of fear she carried. But he understood. The ranch, broken as it was a kind of sanctuary, its isolation a shield. He grabbed his coat and hat, the weight of the rifle on the wall tempting but untouched. He didn't need it for town, not yet. The ride to Bitter Creek was long, the trail winding through scrubland that stretched endless and unforgiving. The wagon rattled, its wheels kicking up dust that clung to Amos's skin. The town appeared like a mirage, its low buildings hunched against the wind. He tied the horse at the general store, the street quiet save for a few men lounging outside the saloon, their eyes tracking him with lazy suspicion. Inside the store, the air smelled of coffee and leather, and Amos moved quickly, gathering flour, salt, a tin of peaches for Mary. Something small to break the monotony of beans. As he paid, the storekeeper, a wiry man named Hollis, leaned forward, his voice low. "Heard you got a new cook out there," he said, eyes glinting with curiosity. Amos stiffened, his hand pausing on the coins. "Folks say she's runnin' from somethin'. Man was in here yesterday, a skin after a woman. Described her right down to the braid." Amos's jaw tightened, the memory of the man's shadow by the corral flashing sharp. "Didn't tell him nothin'," Hollis added, sensing the shift in Amos's stance. "But he's still around. Seen him near the livery this mornin'. Amos left the store, the weight of the supplies nothing compared to the dread settling in his gut. He scanned the street, half expecting to see the man's wiry frame lurking in an alley. The town felt smaller now, its edges sharper, like it was closing in. He climbed into the wagon, the reins rough in his hands, and started back, the sky darkening with clouds that smelled of rain. His mind churned, Mary's fear, the man's hunger, the ranch's slow death. He thought of his mother, how she'd left without a fight, and how he'd hated her for it, then himself. He wouldn't let Mary face that choice alone. Back at the ranch, the house was quiet, the kitchen empty. Panic flared in Amos's chest until he saw Mary outside, hanging laundry, her movements slow but steady. The wind tugged at the sheets, snapping them like sails, and she turned, catching his eye. For a moment, they stood there, separated by the yard but bound by something unspoken. He saw the question in her gaze, "Did you see him?" and he shook his head, just enough to ease her. But the lie felt heavy, like the storm gathering overhead. He carried the supplies inside, the tin of peaches cold in his hand, and set them on the table. The choice was coming, he knew, stay silent or act, hide or fight. And for the first time in years, Amos felt the stir of something alive in him, something worth risking. The storm broke at dusk, rain lashing the ranch like a whip, turning the yard to mud. Amos stood by the window, the glass rattling in its frame, watching water carve rivers through the dust. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and coffee, the pot simmering on the stove where Mary worked, her movements quieter now, as if the storm had hushed her too. The tin of peaches sat unopened on the table, a small gesture that felt foolish in the face of what was coming. Amos's hands itched, restless, the memory of the storekeeper's words, "He's still around," gnawing at him like a splinter. He turned from the window, his shadow long across the floor. Mary was kneading dough, her hands steady but her eyes distant, lost in some private battle. The bruise on her wrist was fainter now, but Amos saw it clear as day, a mark of a past that hadn't let her go. He thought of the man in town, his hungry eyes, his claim, "my wife," and the rage that had flared in Amos's chest. But beneath it was something softer, a need to shield her, to give her what he couldn't give his mother. He crossed to the table, the floorboards creaking, and sat, the chair groaning under him. "You ever think of leavin'?" he asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Mary's hands paused, flour dusting her fingers like snow. She didn't look up, but her shoulders tightened, a small shift that spoke louder than words. "Ain't got nowhere to go," she said, her voice low, almost swallowed by the rain's roar. "Tried that already." She resumed kneading, harder now, as if she could press her fear into the dough. Amos leaned forward, elbows on the table, the wood cool against his skin. "You could," he said, softer. "If you wanted. I'd help." Her eyes flicked to his, quick and searching, like she was testing the ground beneath his words. He held her gaze, steady, willing her to see he meant it. But she looked away, back to the dough, her fingers trembling just enough to betray her. "Ain't your burden," she said, and the words cut, not because they were sharp, but because they were true. He'd taken her in, given her work, but what right did he have to her story, her pain? The rain slowed, a steady patter now, and the silence between them grew heavy again. Amos stood, restless, and moved to the door, stepping onto the porch. The air was sharp, clean, the storm's anger spent. Mud clung to his boots, and the horizon was a blur of gray and shadow. He thought of the man in town, waiting, watching, and the choice that loomed: do nothing and let Mary's fear fester, or act and risk everything. The ranch was all he had, a crumbling legacy, but it was something. A place to stand. A place to fight. He heard her behind him, her steps soft on the porch. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, her braid damp from the mist. "He'll come back," she said, not a question but a fact, her voice steady despite the weight of it. Amos nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the storm clouds lingered. "Let him," he said, and the words felt like a vow, though to whom he wasn't sure, her, himself, or the ghosts of his past. She didn't reply, but she stayed there, close enough that he could hear her breathing, steady against the fading rain. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy, it was shared, a fragile bridge built on trust not yet spoken. Amos looked at her, the lines of her face softened by the dim light, and saw not just fear but strength, a woman who'd run and kept running, yet still stood. He thought of his mother, gone without a fight, and vowed he'd be different. The ranch, the land, the emptiness, it could all crumble, but he wouldn't let Mary face her shadow alone. The night settled around them, the air cool and still, the stars breaking through the clouds like small promises. Amos's hands unclenched, the ache in them easing, and he felt the weight of his choice settle, not as a burden but as a purpose. The rain had washed the dust away, leaving the earth raw and new, and for the first time in years, Amos felt the stir of something like hope. The dawn came soft, a pale light creeping over the horizon, painting the ranch in shades of gray and gold. The mud from last night's storm had hardened, leaving the yard a patchwork of cracks, like the land itself was scarred. Amos stood by the corral, his breath visible in the chill, his hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee that had gone cold. The air smelled of wet earth and sage, a fleeting freshness before the sun burned it away. He hadn't slept, his mind tangled with the man in town, Mary's bruises, and the weight of a choice he'd made without fully understanding it. The rifle leaned against the fence, its presence a quiet promise. Inside, Mary was already at work, the faint clink of dishes drifting through the open window. Amos watched the house, its sagging roof and peeling paint a mirror of his own worn edges. He thought of the years he'd spent fighting the land, the drought, the loneliness, each loss carving him down to something raw, something stubborn. But Mary's arrival had shifted something in him, like a stone dislodged from a riverbed. Her fear, her resilience, had woken a part of him he'd thought long dead, a need to protect, to stand firm, even if it cost him everything. He drained the last of the coffee, bitter and cold, and walked toward the house. The door creaked as he entered, the kitchen warm with the smell of biscuits and bacon. Mary stood at the stove, her back to him, her braid swaying slightly as she worked. The bruise on her wrist was nearly gone, a faint shadow now, but Amos felt its weight still, a reminder of what she carried. He set the mug on the table, the sound loud in the quiet, and she turned, her eyes meeting his. They were steady now, less like storm clouds and more like the sky after rain, clear, but wary. "Headin' to town again," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "Gotta settle something. Her hand tightened on the spatula, but she didn't ask what. She didn't need to. The air between them held the truth: her husband was out there, a shadow that wouldn't fade. Amos waited, giving her a chance to speak, to stop him, but she only nodded, her lips pressed thin. "Be careful," she said, so soft it barely reached him, but it landed like a stone in his chest. The ride to Bitter Creek was slower today, the horses' hooves sinking into the soft earth. The town was waking, its streets alive with the clatter of wagons and the low hum of voices. Amos tethered the horse outside the livery, his eyes scanning the crowd. He didn't know the man's face, not fully, but he'd know the hunger in his eyes, the kind that marked a man who took what wasn't his. He moved through the streets, past the saloon, the blacksmith, the church with its cracked bell, until he saw him, leaning against a post near the livery, his coat still tattered, his gaze sharp and searching. Amos approached, his boots steady on the ground, his hands loose but ready. The man straightened, sensing the purpose in Amos's stride. "Told you to stay away," Amos said, voice low, cutting through the morning's hum. The man's mouth twisted, not quite a smile. "She's mine," he said, stepping closer, his hands flexing. "You got no claim." Amos didn't flinch, didn't reach for a weapon. He thought of Mary's trembling hands, her quiet strength, and his mother's empty chair. "She ain't property," he said, the words final, like a gate slamming shut. The man lunged, quick and desperate, but Amos was ready, his fist meeting the man's jaw with a crack that echoed down the street. The man stumbled, blood on his lip, and for a moment, the town held its breath, eyes watching, whispers rising. Amos stood tall, his chest heaving, not from the fight but from the release of years of pent-up grief. "Leave," he said again, and this time, the man listened, staggering back, then turning, disappearing into the dust of the street. Amos returned to the ranch as the sun climbed higher, the light soft now, like a hand brushing away the dark. Mary was outside, hanging laundry again, the sheets catching the breeze. She looked up as he approached, her eyes searching his face, seeing the bruise on his knuckles, the resolve in his stance. She didn't ask, didn't need to. The silence between them was warm now, like the dawn, and Amos felt the cracks in the earth beneath his feet, still there but healing, like the land itself might breathe again.